thank you so much for coming, and thank you especially to Mary Ann Sieghart and Amber Rudd, two women who need no introduction, I think, from us, but who between them have a wealth of experience in the world of politics, of office politics, and in the media. We're here this evening to talk about Mary Ann's new book, The Authority Gap, which is why, amazingly, women still aren't taken as seriously as men, and what we can do about it. Over to you, Mary Ann.
Well, thanks so much, Hilly. So the authority gap is about how much harder women have to work to be taken seriously than men do. So most of us just assume that a man knows what he's talking about until he proves otherwise. But for women, it's just all too often the other way around. So we find that our ability is underestimated, our views are ignored in favour of men's. How often have you said something at a meeting for it to be utterly ignored, only for a man to say it 10 minutes later and suddenly it's the second coming? We find that our expertise is challenged and our authority is questioned. So instinctively, we still tend to take women less seriously than men. And when I say we, that's sometimes women as well as men. And the academic research really backs this up, and the book is full of academic studies to give you absolutely watertight evidence and ammo. And it's also full of interviews with really interesting, successful women like Amber, who have experienced this all through their life. And my view was, if they've experienced it, then surely that just must be true for the rest of womankind. Now, of course, not all women and not all men, because some men are great at respecting us equally, and thank God for them. We're really grateful, we really notice. And some women are brilliant at exerting authority with great success, but boy, do they have to work hard at it. So why is it so much more difficult for women than for men? Well, of course, there's always overt sexism, but there's a lot of covert bias too. We just make it so much harder for women to get things right. It's just harder for women to come across right in a way that it isn't for men. So take confidence, for instance. Of course, in order to be taken seriously, you've got to come across as confident in your opinions. If you're incredibly hesitant, nobody's really going to listen to you. So if you're not confident enough, no one's going to take you seriously. But if you are as confident and assertive as a man, then things go wrong too. Quite often we, and I mean women as well as men, will recoil from a woman who's very confident and assertive. And we'll find ourselves using adjectives like abrasive, strident, aggressive, bossy, overbearing, ball-breaking, even bitchy. And so we dislike her. And once we dislike a woman, then frankly, she has very little chance, particularly in the job market, because all the evidence shows that particularly when men are hiring or promoting, they put likability top of the list for women, which they don't do for men. So why do we have this reaction to women who are as confident and assertive as men? Well, the problem is that we still have these nasty, sneaky little stereotypes that sort of lurk in the base of our brain, telling us that women ought to be kind and nurturing and warm and unthreatening and unself-promoting and uncompetitive and gentle, whereas men ought to be competent and assertive and confident and in charge and showing leadership. But if a woman wants to get on in any sort of career, she has to have those characteristics as well. But once she starts showing them, we think, oh, this feels wrong. We feel uncomfortable. It just feels too masculine somehow. And so we punish her as a result. So women have to work incredibly hard to make themselves likable as well as confident and competent. So there's this incredibly narrow path that they have to tread between being not confident enough and therefore disrespected, or being confident enough and therefore disliked. And that is a path that men just don't have to navigate. And this is true in all sorts of other aspects of working life as well, which relate to the authority gap. So for instance, let's think about talking in public. So if you wire men and women up for the day and measure the number of words they've spoken, it's pretty much the same. It's not true, as the stereotype goes, that women are chatterboxes and men are sort of strong and silent. But in public settings, men talk much more than women. And then women are marked down for promotion because people say, oh, she just doesn't talk enough, she doesn't contribute enough at meetings, she needs to lean in, she needs to be more assertive. But of course, it's the same double bind. If we don't talk enough, we're not taken seriously. But as soon as we start talking as much as men, people think that we dominated the conversation. And they don't like women who talk too much. So again, we have this incredibly narrow path that we have to navigate between talking too little and not being listened to, talking too much, and being actually thought to be less competent than we are. So women need the sort of agility of an Olympic gymnast on a balance beam to get this right, whereas men can just saunter along the floor. We see this also with self-promotion. So, if you want a pay rise, if you want to be promoted, you have to explain to people how well you've done in your job. That's just a sort of basic tenet. Men are allowed to do this, women aren't. If women self-promote, we dislike it. And we often tend to penalize them. And so people who say, oh, the gender pay gap is all just women's fault, if only they asked for more money, they'd get it. It isn't true. Women do negotiate as much as men, but they're not given the pay rise and the promotion as readily as men are. And this is particularly the case if they're negotiating with a male hirer, who are much less likely to hire a woman who negotiates than a man who negotiates. Boys can boast, men can boast, women aren't allowed to. It's probably why Private Eye used to satirize me as Mary Ann Bighead, which is pretty much another way of saying, woman, know your place. And finally, I'd like to talk about influence in a meeting. So again, women are much less likely to be able to influence a meeting than men are, even if they're experts. In fact, bizarrely, particularly if they're experts. So social psychologists have run all sorts of experiments. They're usually oddly based on survival techniques. So it's how to survive on the moon or how to survive a bushfire or something like that. And they interview all the candidates in advance to find out how much they know about this subject. And what they find is that if a man knows about the subject and is therefore deemed an expert, his views will really influence the rest of the group and will be used in their final decision-making. A woman's views don't influence the group. And in fact, if anything, the women experts are less influential than the women non-experts. And that's because they tend to really press their case because they know what they're talking about. But the other people, A, don't believe they do know what they're talking about, and B, don't like a woman challenging the consensus in the way that they're perfectly happy for a man to challenge the consensus. So one study, for instance, gave the group lots of information about a child custody case, but they gave individual members just one piece of information that the rest of the group didn't know. And when that piece of information was introduced by a man, it was 6 times more likely to be part of the group's final decision than when it was introduced by a woman. So this is all incredibly depressing. I have got quite a lot of solutions at the end of the book. Really hope that men are going to read this book as well as women, because I don't think anything will change unless men do. But I was very pleased to see a man reviewing it in the Sunday Times last week and warmly recommending it to other men. So let's hope that's just the very beginning. So Amber, I think you and I are going to talk about how you've experienced this sort of problem in politics and how you've dealt with it. So should we start with cabinet? How does this sort of behaviour manifest itself in cabinet?
A very good place to start. Mary Ann, can I first of all say how pleased I am to be here. So thank you for inviting me to join you for this. And also how much I enjoyed the book, because there's so much in there, which, as you rightly say, many of us recognise, but we think it's just the odd anecdote. And until you actually hear from somebody else, in which you put it here, about the facts around it, the studies around it, you don't realise that it's not just you experiencing 1 or 2 events. It's actually an actual theme on authority. So I think that's why this is such an interesting book. It's because it actually doesn't sort of just dwell on your instincts. It talks about the facts of what's actually going on. So thank you for that. And in cabinet, yes, of course, cabinet's a classic power situation where the women are very much in the minority. And one of the things that annoys me most is that it's assumed that women are not really, in a way, entitled to be there, because what happens is every time there's a reshuffle, the Prime Minister, whoever it is reminded by the press that they've made some commitment usually 30, 40, occasionally 50% equal cabinet. And they rush around in a mad lather going, quick, quick, get me some women. And so quite often there hasn't been the planning of it ahead of time, thinking about which jobs might go to Mary Ann or to Amber, so giving them a junior ministerial position. And it can look a bit forced, which then creates the additional antagonism you get from the men who say, listen, there's only X% of women MPs here. If more than X% are going to be in cabinet, then I'm at a disadvantage. I will never, you actually hear them saying, I won't get promoted, I'm not a woman. And which reminds me of one of your other anecdotes about non-executive directors, which I've now encountered, now I'm out of cabinet, when people say, oh, I can't get to be a non-executive director, I'm not a woman. And as you cleverly pointed out by a fact-based anecdote in your book, that is not actually what's happening. But in cabinet, in terms of the conversations, it's quite a formal environment. So I've served 3 different prime ministers in 3 different jobs, and they all do this thing of making a list of whoever puts up their hand, and then they go to each person in order. And my general default was to try and go early, because usually if there's a topic, there's going to be something quite interesting to say about it if you get in early, like 2 or 3 interesting things to say about whatever the topic is. But if you're going to be 15th down the list, I expect everything might have been said. So generally I would go in early, unless it was a really interesting topic that I felt very strongly about. So frankly, my knowledge base was going to be better. And also going last means you can sum up everybody else and just push it in a certain direction. So Theresa May could see I was doing this. And I talked to her about it afterwards, actually. She found it quite entertaining. And she would sometimes take people's names and then move them around the list, because the list itself became a power list, who got to go last to sum it up. But generally, you needed to participate in cabinet. You had to find your way in. And my tip really in those sort of power set pieces is to go early, because usually, potentially here with the questions, who knows, people are slow to actually get going. Once they get going, you can't get in. So get in early.
Now, people often say that Boris has a woman problem. Did you come across this?
I think he's much more comfortable with blokes. And so there's a kind of blokey bonhomie about him that you are much more likely to have established in those relationships with men you've been at university with, men you can socialize with, men who have the same hobbies as you. And I think that professional women are more of a rarity to Boris in terms of his friendships. Hence, he doesn't really have very many around him.
And of course, you know, men say they can't get into cabinet, but there are 3 times as many men as women in today's cabinet. He was actually praised for promoting women, and yet he promoted 3 times as many men as women. Yeah, and that is part of the problem. And my particular bête noire too is when I criticise Boris for that, saying where are the women, bring more women on. Number 10 gives out the line sometimes saying there are some very bright young women who we will be moving up the ladder to get into cabinet, as though women are somehow a disability group you need to help along, rather than just equals as MPs and just as good. Yeah. When you were actually talking in cabinet, did you sometimes find or feel that the men just weren't listening as attentively to you, or that you were finding it harder to influence the men? Cabinet is a complicated place with different alliances across different departments. And of course, during the Brexit wars, it very much divided along the Brexit side. But I did find myself instinctively doing what you write about, or I think Madeleine Albright caught out on first, about this business about reinforcing other women. And certainly I felt that the other women did the same to me, listened more carefully, engaged with the topic much more. And sometimes the men would just definitely talk for longer, although the mantra that came afterwards was about certain women talking too much. So that was very much experienced. I do remember one particularly animated cabinet when Geoffrey Cox, in his great booming authoritative voice, went on for quite a long time. And Claire Perry just tore into him for mansplaining to the rest of us, which did take him aback a little bit. And how did you deal with very male-orientated hierarchical organizations? For instance, when you were Home Secretary, you know, you were dealing with the police a lot, security services. Well, so I think that, funnily enough, on security services, it's had
It's had female leaders. That makes a big difference. If an organization has had a female leader, I think that changes the culture of everybody else to a certain extent. A large issue is about numbers, but having had a female leader makes a big difference. And so, the Home Office obviously had Theresa May there for 6 years. And so I think that she had established herself in that way. So it wasn't a rarity to see a woman. I do remember, though, having the FBU, the Fire Brigade Union, in, and the firemen are really male dominated. They really had, I don't know what the numbers are now, but I think they make the police look very gender balanced by comparison. And I remember they came in to see me, and all male team. I mean, you come in to see a female Home Secretary, you bring an all male team, you're not paying attention. And they sat down in front of me to make their, points, demands, whatever they were. And I said, are there any women on this board? And they said, yes, we've got one of those. So the fact that, and I said to them, you better look after her then, because they had just the one. And there is, it's a start, but there is sometimes a feeling, I think, that if people have got 1 or 2, or perhaps in the Cabinet's case, 7 or 8, then that's sufficient. So that's why I think it's so important to keep pushing from the outside. But I do find it interesting, this whole point, though, which has taken root now, that it's somehow all about the women, that the men have a difficulty when the women are still in a minority everywhere, which, I'm interested in your view on that, Mary Ann. Is that because the pipeline is thin, so the women who do get through are quite in demand? And that's the area that needs to be focused on, because the men in politics, as you will know, in the corporate sector, feel that they have much less opportunity now.
Yeah, and actually they don't. But this is a classic response to people who are starting to lose their privilege, that instead of feeling that we're turning, we're moving towards a level playing field, they feel they're instantly being flattened. And it simply isn't the case. But because privilege is so invisible, they feel very, very threatened, I think, by the suggestion that women ought to have. We're not asking to dominate the world. All we want is equality, but they fear female domination.
And they still feel, in my experience, that allowing women to be a quarter or a third of the power group is an enormously generous position of them to take. And
yes.
And I was interested in your earlier comments about how women and men view this. I have lost times of the number of references to me as head girl or head teacher. And that is as much by women journalists as men.
Yeah, absolutely. It's all this sort of classic stereotypical tropes. So you're a head teacher or a head girl, or you're a matron. I mean, it's
games teacher.
Yes, games teacher. So these are all characters who are basically only in charge of you if you're either a child or you're sick.
Yes.
Which itself is interesting, isn't it? It's sort of somehow infantilizing. Now, how do you deal with bad behavior, Amber?
Well, it's easier when you're a Secretary of State, because the very title gives you authority. But in my experience, people don't necessarily change their behavior, but you are, in a way, entitled to call it out. So we would have what they call prayers every week. So you have the Secretary of State with the ministers and various interested MPs, 10 or 15 or 20 of you, discussing the issues for the week. And every now and again, there would be something. I remember there was some reference, some male MP making a sort of slightly crude reference to size. Shall I just put it like that? And I just called him out on it and said, we're not going to talk like that in this room. And the thing is, it lowers the temperature in the room, which you then have to recover, which is quite difficult. It would have been easier to laugh it off. And then I had a couple of other MPs come up to me afterwards saying, you were a bit hard on him. And I'm like, no, we're not going to have that sort of language, which is sort of asserting their maleness. And the other thing I would do, which I wasn't really so conscious of at the time, but I was thinking about it, reflecting on this upcoming conversation. And if people are challenge your authority in a biggish group like that, you can't let it pass. But I am not a person who takes people on in an angry tone and has a fight with them in front of other people. Other people might do that. Gosh, I've seen other people do that. That's not my style. So what I would say is, Mary Ann, that was a very interesting comment. Don't agree with you. Could you stay afterwards? So I'd always make that person stay afterwards for a conversation. And then the meeting would empty and everyone else going out would go, ooh, she's in for some trouble, or he's going to get a telling off. And then I just sit down with them and they would, by that point, be rather nervous and explain to them why they made a mistake raising that issue or raising it in that tone, and I expected more. It worked much better because then that person actually probably hears the argument, understands it, can't falling over themselves to apologize because they haven't been humiliated in front of everybody else, and is your ally going forward. So I deal with confrontation in privacy of another meeting.
Yeah, good. I think that's good advice. Now, Sarah is asking, what do you think of the way female partners, straight wives of politicians are treated? It didn't seem that Philip May was treated in the same way. Indeed, nor was Dennis Thatcher. What do you think, Amber?
No, I think that's true. It is. I mean, it's a very hard life for the partners of high-profile politicians. I mean, you know, Samantha Cameron did very well. It can be done, but I think that the whole area of the press, don't you know about it, wanting to examine how people look, which is generally a female thing, and how they feel, their emotions, it's much more fun for them to go after the women. I mean, it just is the fact that people like to have pictures of what the wife of the politician is wearing and refer to the clothes, etc., than what Philip May or Dennis Thatcher would have been wearing. So that is just an extra burden you carry. But overall, senior roles in politics, I mean, not so much as an MP, a bit as an MP, but then more and more as you get higher up the ladder, are really hard for your family, hard for them because of the intrusion. And if you slip up, it's really hard for them, as a recent Secretary of State has discovered.
But also, I think wives and girlfriends of prime ministers are treated very differently from husbands if they try to influence what the prime minister is doing. So, you know, people would think, oh, it's rather good that Theresa's got Philip May there to advise her. You know, he's very experienced and he's sort of wise and he's sound. No one batted an eyelid that Philip May was advising Theresa. But the idea that Carrie should advise Boris is treated as anathema, even though she's actually spent her entire career in politics. And I
agree. She comes under a lot of trouble for that, as did Sherry Blair.
Yeah, suddenly they're Lady Macbeth.
Yes. The parallels in sort of those sort of novels or plays are too easy for people to grab hold of.
Yeah. Okay, here's a question from Fiona Robertson. What would each of you cite as your key top tips to be seen as authoritative? And do you think women can find a way to be seen as authoritative without imitating male confidence / mannerisms? Well, I'll go first and then I'll ask Amber what she thinks. The one thing I've found through my research is that the only way women can successfully convey authority without being disliked or rejected is by ladling oodles of warmth on top of everything they do. And this is particularly when they're dealing with men. And so if you're going to be competent and confident and assertive, you have to smile a lot, you have to use humor, you have to be very careful, as Amber was, not to humiliate them in public. That, I think, is the only way to navigate your way through, which can be quite exhausting, but it's the only thing that works, in my view. What do you think, Amber?
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely true. You have to be careful not to make enemies on the way, but there are ways of doing that by thinking of other people the whole time too. So everybody matters. Don't ignore anybody. Thank everybody on the way. Engage everybody in terms of asking them their views. Don't look over their shoulders. The sort of stuff that goes on in politics the whole time. So just being more thoughtful about other people makes a big difference. But the other thing, and I say this, I get calls sometimes from junior women ministers saying, how do I make the next move? And I say to them, you've got to be seen. You can't duck doing any questions or question time or say, I don't want to do the Today programme. You've got to find a way of arranging your life so that you are seen and heard, because in politics, you have to be able to defend your position and score runs for the government. And you won't just get noticed for being competent unless you are also confident, to use your phrases, Mary Ann. And to be a leader, you've got to show that you're out there better than everybody else and being able to deliver it. And for me, my big breakthrough was being able to deliver a very tricky bill through Parliament when I was a junior energy minister, which David Cameron noticed. And then when I was as Energy Secretary, I was asked to play a role in the Brexit referendum. That got me into the public eye and made me somebody who leaders felt they could trust to communicate, because so much of politics is about communication and winning points for them. That made a big difference. But I learned how to do that. It's not, a lot of men, go to school and they start practicing their public speaking, and let's face it, they take every opportunity to do so. When I decided I wanted to become an MP, I thought I couldn't do it because I couldn't public speak. I just didn't know how I would get around what most sane people have, which is a fear of public speaking. But in the end, I did. And I did it by starting small. You got selected for Hastings and Ryan, started doing the local bridge club and then the local charity, and you slowly build up and you realize that actually you can definitely do this. But it's so that is an area which I would also urge everybody else to get as much practice in as they can, because it is not as intimidating and scary as some people think it is. And it's important, I think, for almost everything you do in life, if you want to get on, to be able to have the confidence to do the public speaking and to be able to pick yourself up when you make a mistake.
Yeah, practice is so important. I remember the very first time I was asked to do a TV program, and it was actually only a pilot, so they weren't even going to broadcast it. I was in my early 20s. And I remember my heart was beating so fast before it started that I thought, what if I have a heart attack? Will the paramedics come in and pick me up off the floor? Will I actually collapse? I mean, it was actually that bad. And now I've done it so often that I almost barely notice I'm on. My pulse rate might go up a little, but it really is just practice. And I completely agree with Amber there. I think just confront your fear, do it anyway, and you'll find it gets a lot easier.
And start small. You don't have to start with sort of big BBC debate or anything.
No, exactly. But actually, you did do that. So you represented the Prime Minister in a debate in the European referendum, didn't you? What was that like?
Well, I did two big debates. One was for the referendum, and the other was in the 2017 general election when I stood in for Theresa May. Both of them were terrifying, but also quite fun. I reached the stage where I quite enjoy them. But one of the things I always equip myself with is a few good lines. But until you've actually delivered them, you don't know whether they're going to bomb. And some of them did bomb, but some of them didn't. And you just have to be able to pick yourself up once you've done it as well. So again, it's practice, but I arrived at that having done a lot of public speaking, and it took me years to get to that stage. But now it makes you feel quite confident when you go and do other things to do with public speaking.
Can you think of the worst example of being disrespected or patronized in your time in politics? You've gone on mute. I know.
When I was reading your book, I saw that you had a situation where you were called a little girl, and just after I'd resigned as Home Secretary, I went. I'm in Barron's Court, and around the corner for me is Queen's Club, and I used to, for about 4 weeks afterwards, I had protection officers, because you don't go immediately off the high risk record. And I used to go in there and just sit and have a cup of coffee. And I remember this old man leaning over and go, "Amber Rudd." And I went, "Yes, good girl." I mean, it was meant with affection. There was no, but it was just like, "Good girl,"
Now, Kate Macmillan is asking, what can we do to ensure a more diverse and representative cabinet? And what do you think of the consequences of the current gender bias in cabinet on policy?
Well, I think that one of the things we can do is continually call it out, because otherwise nothing will happen. So I don't think there's much more we can do than that. It's just continue to say it's a disgrace and something needs to be done about it. Highlighting it makes it better. I think that if you don't have an equal number of women or close to it, it has a bad effect on policy. That women's issues are not going to be considered in the same way as being prioritised they should be. And we experienced that really at the start of the pandemic, when the issue of schools and childcare was so slow to come in. I expect everybody on this call knows the fact is that women do tend to raise these issues because they're part of their life experience in a way that men don't.
Yeah, I mean, I can remember when I was at the Times, and I was one of only 2 women out of, I think, 22 at morning conference. And when I raised things like childcare, the men would literally roll their eyes and look at each other, you know, there she goes again. And yet half our readers, and probably more, but the fathers too, actually really minded about this sort of thing.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely the case. It's bad for policy, and it's bad for having, you know, for showing a government that is supposed to represent this country as not having enough women involved.
Now, Hilly James is asking, do you think it's important where you sit when you're in a boardroom around a table? She said, I've heard in the middle is best.
Yeah, I mean, in cabinet, it's very much based on your status. So there's a set position where you sit, and opposite the Prime Minister is considered the best place. So the sort of deputy Prime Minister type figure sits opposite her, the Chancellor, her or him. The Chancellor sits on the left, and the Cabinet Secretary sits on her right. And then everybody sort of is put in different positions depending on the size of their department, their longevity and stuff. But location of where you are in terms of your office is equally important. And I would say that being close as you can to the seat of power, to the person who has the power, is more important than having a larger office. I always used to tell that to new MPs. It doesn't matter if you've got a huge office across in Portcullis House. What you want is a tiny box office near the actual chamber, near the Chancellor's office, near the Home Secretary's offices, near the Prime Minister's office. You want to be close to where the power is. I mean, that's a very basic, important message to have.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, I know you've only got another sort of 5 or 8 minutes. So was there anything you wanted to ask me, perhaps? I've asked all the questions on the chat that were particularly aimed at you.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you, just in association with what one of those earlier questions was, what else could we do to try and get politicians to recognise that they need to have more women in authority? I mean, I look at the Conservative Party, and we don't have enough women MPs, but we have a certain amount of pressure to get them through to the top. I look at the Labour Party, and they've got many more women MPs, 50-50, just slightly more. But I was talking to one of my children yesterday, and he couldn't get over the idea they'd never had a woman leader. In a way, I think that in politics, it's more of a problem than it is in the corporate boardroom, because I think ultimately in the corporate world, it will be driven by shareholders and by regulation. But in politics, what else do you think we should be doing?
It's so difficult, isn't it? Because I don't think that well, one of the problems is that for the Conservative Party in particular, they, as you said earlier, they see it as a bit of a sort of woke issue. You know, why should this matter? It should only be a question of merit, as if somehow women aren't as good as men. But actually, women find it much harder to be selected, even when they're better than men. They find it harder to be selected, even as candidates, to stand for election. So, you know, the odds are stacked against them right from the beginning. And it is partly a question of representativeness. You know, it is supposed to be a representative democracy, and we make up, what, 51% of the electorate. But it shouldn't just be a question of fairness. It should be a question of who governs well. And we all know now that in every organization, the more diverse the group of decision makers at the top, the better it's run. We see this through shareholder returns in companies, and we see, you know, boards that are very sort of mono, either all men or all white or all of a certain background, tend just to make worse decisions. So countries will be better governed if they have a better diversity at the top. But I think the pandemic has been very educational, because we've all seen how on the whole, countries with female leaders have performed so much better than countries with male ones on average. And that is, you know, tens or hundreds of thousands of lives saved by these women. And if anyone ever wondered whether women leaders weren't as good as men, I think this pandemic has proved, you know, very much the opposite. And particularly a certain type of man, a sort of blustering, egotistical, thinking that he and his country are exceptional, that sort of leader. Of course, I'm thinking of Trump, but also to an extent of Boris Johnson and Putin and Bolsonaro and Erdogan. And you look at the death rates of their countries compared with countries such as Germany, led by Angela Merkel, or New Zealand, led by Jacinda Ardern, and the difference is absolutely huge.
But the men you mentioned all have this extraordinary strong man sort of mentality and charisma to engage. I mean, the fact that Trump beat Hillary Clinton was about his extraordinary sort of strong personality and that Hillary Clinton just wasn't able to overcome in terms of showing her own intelligence and ability to govern. So it's that business of who can govern, but who can campaign. And maybe women need to learn to be better at campaigning rather than just being able to govern, because otherwise I worry that we're never going to get women in those strong, big roles unless they can actually connect with the public in a way that the public seem to want to be being connected with. We can't tell the public that they're wrong for electing Trump rather than Hillary Clinton and Berlusconi. Not so much about elections, but still it's the same theme. And I wonder whether, as I say, the women aren't quite are coming over as too, it's that business they often say, used to say about Nigel Farage, a nice man to have a beer with, maybe we need to be a little bit more showing of our personalities.
Yes, but the trouble is, back to what I was saying earlier, a lot of people said of Hillary, oh, she's unlikable. And then we had about 8 or 9 women contesting the Democratic primary next time round. And all of them were described as unlikable too.
Yeah,
and you start to think, well, hang on, is that telling us more about the women or actually about our reaction to the idea of a woman trying to become the presidential nominee? And social studies show that a woman being power seeking, which you have to be if you want to be a politician, we recoil at. We have a sense of disgust and moral revulsion at women seeking power, which we don't at men seeking power. So it's actually terribly hard to get over that obstacle.
It's true. And again, in the articles that were written about me when they wanted to be rude, they were generally, it was all like not only headmistressy, but also ambitious.
Yes, yes. So one of the women I interviewed for the book was Elaine Chao, who was transportation secretary under Trump. And she was described in the liberal New York Times, of all places, as unapologetically ambitious. And I thought, what does she have to apologize for?
Quite, nothing at all. Be ambitious.
Yes, exactly. And of course, to succeed in any career, you have to be ambitious. I was described as ambitious so much when I was a young journalist that someone said in a profile, her children must think it's her middle name. And none of my male rivals were ever described as ambitious. So of course they were. Yeah. But another thing I was going to say about Trump versus Hillary was that the second biggest predictor of voting for Trump after being a member of the Republican Party was having hostile sexist views. So, agreeing with certain horrible statements about women, that was the predictor of voting for Trump. So however good Hillary had been at campaigning, I don't think those people were going to vote for her.
I'm afraid when we did some polling ahead of the Brexit referendum, one of the ones was, this is going to go down like a lead balloon amongst Brexit voters, but still, is that women's emancipation has gone too far. And that was quite popular with Brexit voters as well.
Yes, I think that was actually also one of the biggest predictors of voting Brexit, was if you agreed with that.
Yeah. Well, it did have, we must go back to the Brexit wars, but there were, women tended to be more Remainers. It was one of those distinctions, wasn't it?
Yeah. Now, I think one last question before you have to go maybe, but Fiona Robertson says, addressing harassment on social media might help some women be more open to a public role. The media is getting a bit better at calling itself out when portrayals of female politicians are skewed to their shoes or other details. Think about that.
Yes, I mean, I remember when, I think it was the Mail, ran a picture of Nicola Sturgeon and Theresa May. And they said, never mind Brexit, what about Lexit? And I saw that Theresa May responded, or her team did, saying, oh, it's just a bit of fun. And you do have to take that attitude sometimes, because if you call it out when it's sort of humiliating reference to your legs or whatever, then you will just be the party pooper and you will lose support. So I think that's sort of just, it doesn't really answer Fiona's question, but it's one of the things that I observe as a senior woman. But harassment is a horrific element of being in politics. It's a consequence of any role in public life, in my experience, but nothing worse than politics, where people think that they're entitled somehow to harass you because you've chosen to go into politics, as though you give them permission to do so. So again, I think the only way to deal with that is to constantly call it out. But I also observe that you're not going to get rid of it all the time, because there's so much on social media. Social media has basically given permission to get, if you follow your own timeline, which I never did as a Secretary of State, because you can't, but you give people the ability to whisper horrible things into your ear. And it's just a consequence, again, of public life. And so I conclude this. I admire every woman who goes into politics, who takes up public office, every one of them, because they put themselves in the harm's way in this way. And nevertheless, they go ahead and do it. And they do it because they believe in it, and they endure this personal and sometimes family harassment. And it takes great courage.
And female politicians are much more likely to be harassed online than male ones, and women of colour, who are also politicians, even worse. Poor Diane Abbott gets the worst of it, I think.
Yes, I agree.
I do think if social media companies didn't allow anonymity, that would make an enormous difference. I think if people had to show their identity in order to register on, say, Twitter, you know, they wouldn't make rape threats and death threats, because they could be tracked down. I mean, this seems to me a problem that social media companies could address quite easily.
Yes and no. I mean, there are, you know, fantastic revolutions taking place all over the world where the anonymity is a requirement to stop being locked up. And if you have the if you abandoned anonymity, then there would be less opportunity for that, and or people would just go elsewhere to have their exchanges.
Yes, but it wouldn't be quite so public.
It wouldn't be quite so public. It's true.
I mean, the tragic thing is that you don't have to be a public figure to be trolled really quite seriously on social media. I mean, in the most distressing chapter I wrote was about this backlash against women having a voice. And
yeah.
Even 13-year-olds putting up YouTube videos on how to braid their hair are getting rape threats in the comments section.
Yeah, that is horrific, absolutely horrific. Mary Ann, I'm going to have to leave you and your team. Thank you very much for the opportunity to talk to you. I hope I've given some people a couple of interesting things to think about. And I must tell you, I've so enjoyed your book. So thank you for that as well.
Thank you for coming on, Amber. You've been fascinating. Thank you so much.
Bye.
Great. Okay, let's see. So there are some more questions here that we didn't get to. Yes. How do women in journalism matter to our perceptions of women in authority, stroke expert women? What differences can women in journalism make? Now, a huge amount, I think, in two ways. One is the people whom we quote as experts in news stories. At the moment, only 19% of people quoted as experts in news stories are female. Now, some people are really making an effort to change this. So the BBC has started a 50-50 project. Lots of its programs have joined up to ensure that men and women are on screen and on air 50% of the time each, where there is discretion. So obviously, if the Prime Minister's a man, that doesn't count in the statistics because you can't change that. But that has had an enormous effect, I think, on our sort of internal stereotypes of women in authority. The fact that if you listen to the Life Scientific, half the people they interview are women, you know, makes us think, yeah, you're just as likely to be a scientist if you're a woman as if you're a man. Whereas about 40 years ago, when children were asked to draw a scientist, 99% of the drawings were of men. It's now got down to about 75%, but I wouldn't be surprised in 10 years' time if it got closer to 50%, because female scientists are now getting so much more exposure on air. But we really need to make an effort in news stories. Ed Wong, who's a science writer for The Atlantic, thought that he was very liberal and progressive, but decided to count up what percentage of his sources were female over a year, and it was only 25%. So he made a big effort. So first of all, he asked, well, is it just that I'm trying to get in touch with these women and they're not replying as much as the men? No, that wasn't the case at all. So he decided to make a big effort to make it 50-50. And he managed to do that over the course of the year. And he said he reckoned it only took him about 15 more minutes per story to do that. But the problem was that other journalists were lazy. And so at the top of your Google search, there was always a man, because that was who other journalists had gone to. And it wasn't very hard to find a woman who was just as expert and interview her. But he says it's like an elastic band, that you have to keep pulling at it, because as soon as you let go and stop making the effort, it just snaps back to the default. So you really have to make an effort. He says you must count and make sure that this is happening. Otherwise, you just assume you're doing it and you're not. But then there's also the question of how we write about women. in our, I mean, most of the journalists here, I think, are probably print journalists, how we write about women. And as we've sort of talked about a bit before, you know, women are judged so much more by their appearance. I think we hold women to higher standards than we do men. And I think a helpful thing would be, when you've finished writing a story that's about a woman, just check through and say, would I have said that about a man? And if not, delete, frankly. Do we have to talk about her handbag or her lipstick? And I think gradually, if we start doing that, particularly for women in positions of authority, that will start to percolate down into our feelings about women in general. I hope that was a good enough answer. Just trying to see if there's any. What advice have you got for young women in particular? I'm a teacher at an independent school, and they found this year particularly difficult to navigate. I'm not surprised. And as a teacher, trying to help them when they think they have no voice is too, well, probably difficult too. Yeah. So two aspects here. Partly, how do you navigate having authority yourself as a young woman, but also how can you encourage girls to have the sort of confidence to speak out that boys do? So, okay, the authority gap is bad for women. It's particularly bad for young women, and of course, women of color and disabled women and working class women. But young women can often sound childish in a way that young men can't, merely because their voice breaks. So if a young woman has a slightly high voice, she's going to sound more childish, and subliminally, we're often going to think, because of course children don't really have authority, so we're going to associate her with not being authoritative. But there is also a ghastly way in which we, but particularly men, patronize young women in a way that they don't patronize young men. They see young men as being like them when they were younger, and they want to encourage them and help them. They see young women as people to sort of pat on the head. It's very difficult. I would say slightly lower your voice if you can. I hate to say this, but really try not to dress in a way that other people can think is provocative. Because part of the problem is, if men find you sexy, they're going to assume you don't have a brain. Which again, double standards. We don't assume that handsome men are dim, but we do assume, or some people assume, that beautiful women can't have a brain. So sort of dress down a bit. As for teaching the children and what you can pass on to the next generation, this is a huge problem, is the way we socialize boys and girls. So lots of studies have been done of classrooms showing that boys get to talk so much more in class than girls do. So boys will get rewarded for shouting out answers, whereas girls will be told to put their hand up if they want to speak. And girls learn over the course of getting so much less teacher attention than boys. They learn to be quiet and diligent, keep their head down and behave well. And boys learn to be extrovert, to speak out even if they don't know the answer. And basically we're building, well, I quote someone saying that school is a confidence factory for boys, but only a competence factory for girls, which I think is really sad, that girls in effect get silenced in school. So one of many things you can do as a teacher is wait several seconds when you ask a question before calling on someone to give an answer, because that will enable shyer and more reticent girls to put their hands up, as well as the boys who will instantly do it before they've even thought of the answer. Specifically call on girls to speak, even if they don't put their hand up, because sometimes girls are more embarrassed to be the center of attention, and they think that other girls will disapprove of them if they put themselves forward in a way that boys don't. Boys, on the whole, when they socialize, tend to do it through banter and competitive boasting. My dad's got a better car than yours. I've scored more goals than you. Girls can't get away with that at all. Girls have to be self-effacing and say, oh, I'm useless at maths. Oh, I hate my hair. Oh, my bum's too big. And that's how they bond with other girls. And therefore, they have to be encouraged to speak out at school, I think. And that will give them the confidence in later life. Right. Oh, 5 new messages. Great. Okay. Can you talk a bit about your experience of newsrooms where there seem to be particular barriers to women progressing to senior roles? Mine's a bit out of date because I haven't been in a newsroom for 10 years. But when I was there, they just reeked of testosterone. I noticed at the Times it improved hugely when we had a female, she was only deputy news editor, not a news editor, though I think there has been a woman news editor since. But the atmosphere really changed, and I wish we could have more. But yeah, there's just a very sort of macho feel to newsrooms. And I think, you know, the best you can do is come up with great stories for the news editor to take to conference in the morning, so that basically he feels that your presence is helpful to him, because it's probably a him. You've got to stand up for yourself. You've got to develop a very thick skin. I don't really know what more to say, but things might have changed, so that's probably rather out of date advice. Right. I think, have I missed any questions here? I think it's important as to what roles women have on boards. For example, in our largest listed 350 companies, we don't have enough leaders of boards, chairing boards, who are women. That's absolutely true. So quite a lot of progress has been made on appointing women as non-exec directors to boards, but there are not enough executive directors there who've actually come up through the company itself, and there definitely aren't enough chairs. And I've noticed that on 2 boards now. I've been, we women have actually been a majority, so 3 out of 5 non-execs, but it's always been a man chairing. And in fact, I went up to, you know, I tried to become chair of one of them, but got beaten by a man. Hey-ho. I would just like to talk about one chapter that I think is very interesting, that I think is useful for us women to cite as evidence when people are skeptic. When I say people, it's going necessarily to be men, are skeptical of the existence of the authority gap. And this was a chapter I wrote about the experience of trans people. This has nothing to do with gender identity and the trans wars. But what I thought was, it's always terribly hard for a woman who complains about this sort of behavior, who complains about not being treated equally and being disrespected compared with a man of similar ability, to prove that this is happening to her unfairly, because people are always going to say, well, maybe the man was just better, maybe he deserved more respect. So I started talking to trans men and trans women to find out how their experience of this had changed after they transitioned. And I found universally that trans men, so people who had been living as a woman and were now living as men, said unanimously, it is dramatic how much more we're respected now we're living as men. Now people see us as men. We're taken more seriously. And there was one particular professor at Stanford called Ben Barres, who was a neuroscientist. And he said after he transitioned, I've had the thought 1,000,000 times, I'm taken more seriously now. My work is taken more seriously. The same damn work, as he put it, is taken more seriously. And I can even finish a sentence without being interrupted by a man. And someone was overheard at a seminar of his who didn't know his history, was overheard saying, oh, Ben Barres gave such a great seminar today, but then his work's so much better than his sister's, isn't it? His sister being him. And the great thing about talking to trans people is that everything about them is the same. Their ability, their intelligence, their experience, their personality. And the only thing that has changed is their gender. So you isolate the very variable that matters. And trans women find exactly the opposite, that they transition and suddenly they get talked over, they get interrupted, people don't really listen to them at meetings, their pay or relative pay tends to fall, whereas trans men's pay tends to rise. And to me, this is the most scientific proof that the authority gap exists. Okay, which colleagues report shockingly that they're often still the only women in the room at conference? Blimey, O'Reilly, that's terrible. 2021, any tips on how to get yourself heard? Well, I think you do have to behave. I mean, sorry, I'll start again. When I was the only woman in conference, I decided I had only 2 options. I could either behave in a traditionally feminine way, in which case no one would listen to a word I said. I mean, conference is a very aggressive, competitive, hostile environment in which everybody is bullshitting and wants the others to think that they know more than they do. So I decided the other option was to behave as if I had every right to be in the room, as much right as they did, and to at least act as confident as they were. Maybe not to bullshit quite as much, but at least to sound as sure of my ground as they did. And my voice was heard as a result, even if eyes rolled from time to time. But then I got called Mary Ann Bighead. So, you know, what was then happening was I was being disliked for being as confident and assertive as the men. And as I say, very hard to very hard to get over that, except maybe I didn't show enough warmth. I don't know. Okay. Would anyone else like to be unmuted and ask me a question? Because we've got 2 minutes left. Otherwise, Hilly, what do you think? I've answered all the questions on chat. So it may be a thank you very, very much for coming. And
yeah, I was just sorry, it took me a little while just to unmute myself there. So one thing I did notice in reading the reviews of the book that there's a chapter at the end called "Do Not Despair." Is that right?
Yes.
Any could you just sort of give us a couple of, you know, a quick summary of why we don't need to despair?
Okay, well, I do give you 140 ways to narrow the authority gap.
Brilliant.
So yes, and it's, you know, what you can do as an individual, as a partner, as a parent, as a colleague, as an employer, and what government and society can do. And there are loads of different things that we can do, small things. But the trouble is that because all the behaviors that the authority gap leads to are small in themselves, you know, you get interrupted or you get ignored, whatever it is, none of them, remedying each of them in turn is not, you know, remedying just one of them isn't a silver bullet. But all these little, some people call them microaggressions, but frankly, just irritations, add up over the course of a lifetime, rather like cumulative interest, to, you know, create this enormous gap in achievement between equally qualified men and women. So we've got to address them one step at a time. I'm afraid it's more what men have got to do than what women have got to do. And this absolutely isn't a lean in book saying it's all women's problem. And if only we, you know, were more confident or assertive or whatever, the problem would be solved. Because as I said at the beginning, it's much more complicated than that. But I think we do have to notice our unconscious bias when it displays itself. So it's called unconscious for a reason. We all have it. We all have to admit to having it, however liberal or intelligent or indeed female we are. We all have these biases, but we have to notice when they display themselves and then try to correct for them. So, you know, trivially, if we walk up to a man and a woman standing together, don't automatically address the man first, which I'm sure a lot of people do. If we hear a woman in a meeting being interrupted or talked over, stand up for her and say, oh, I really want to hear what Hilly was saying. Can we please let her finish? Or, oh, Hilly made that point earlier. I'm so glad you agree with her. I think female solidarity is very important. That's something we can do, because if a woman makes a fuss about the treatment that she's been given, I think, as Amber said earlier, she'll be labelled sort of difficult and unlikable and tricky. But if another woman stands up for her, that makes it much easier. I think we're probably running out of time.
Yeah, well, that's a wonderful note to finish on, because I think, you know, female solidarity and supporting each other and speaking up for each other is exactly what women in journalism is about. So thank you, Mary Ann, so much. There was such a lot of insight there. Thank you for bringing Amber to us. It was fascinating to hear some of the machinations that go on behind the scenes in cabinet, and there were lots of really good advice too. So watch out, everyone, for our top tips. We'll be writing them up on the website.